Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name is Nesh Nikolic, and my guest today is Associate Professor Ilan Dar-Nimrod from the School of Psychology at University of Sydney. Ilan's main line of research examines the effects of perceived genetic etiology for various phenomena. Integrating research from diverse disciplines such as psychology, communication, sociology, history, political science, and law, Ilan examines how communication of theories that emphasize genetic explanations can affect a wide variety of psychological outcomes, ranging from test performance to moral evaluations. He asks interesting questions such as, what happens if you have the obesity gene? And what happens if you think you do? He explores how genetic essentialism shapes perception and how this shows up in human life. Ilan is incredibly well-spoken, articulate, knowledgeable, and so easy to talk to. It was such a pleasure to interview Ilan, and hope you enjoy learning from him as much as I did during this conversation. Enjoy. Ilan, thank you so much for coming onto the program today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Nesh. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm really looking forward to looking at the space of combining or molding psychology together with genetics and exploring how we make sense of the world and getting appreciation of, you know, the language that we use and how we've understood it. And obviously there's plenty of myths in this space, many that I probably use myself that I'm actually not aware of what the research actually says. So it'll be fantastic to hear from you today.
It's one of my favorite topics, naturally. So as long as you'll have me, I will be very happy to discuss those things.
Lovely, lovely. How did you get into this space? Why combining these two? I know that you've got other interests as well, but what brought you towards, you know, these two places? What brought those two worlds together for you?
I really need to consider a better origin story than the one I have, because I really don't have a very exciting one. I started my grad school at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and I am an intellectual omnivore. I find interest in pretty much almost everything, and I lose interest in a lot of things once it's going too deep, just because of the new shiny. And I have started my grad school looking at culture, so psychology and culture. I then shifted to look at individual differences in something that is really understudied, basically the kind of idea of what coolness is. I've touched on death and a theory called term management. I went on to do research on maximization tendencies, etc., etc. So I really find a lot of interest in pretty much any new information that comes along my way, where I can find new ideas to try and extend existing research. It was the same for me with genetics and our understanding and categorization. I think the main difference is I just got hooked more on that than on most other things. So it's a staying power rather than a specific, touchy history of a member of a family that had a genetic disease that led me to look at how we understand genetics.
Look, to me, I can certainly say I am attracted to the genetic side as well, just because it has quite significant implications in both sides of where there is a very strong genetic link, and we can hopefully appreciate that, understand it, do things about it, and also about when there might not be, or there's loose links and conversations about how genetics play out that they may or may not. But once that's internalized for a human being, it can have all sorts of interesting ways in which people can integrate that into their lives and make decisions about that as well. Might be useful to start with trying to understand how do genes play, have a play in psychology, other than obviously the variation. I mean, we know that, from an evolutionary perspective, there's a very good reason to have plenty of variation between offspring. But in terms of, the psychology world, we see lots of personality differences that we could say that, a portion of those are very much genetic in nature. How about these bigger categories like, tendencies toward mental health difficulties, whether we're talking about depression or anxiety? I mean, some of these things, I think you could make these easy links, from a conversational style. But I'm interested to hear what do the academics, what do you say? What's actually out there and proven?
So first of all, genetics and its relationship to our soft phenotypes, personality characteristics, etc., rather than structure of the body or elements such as that. Our understanding of inheritance is fascinating from the history of science perspective, how we understood or at least how we lived our life even before we understood the methodology of how we inherit traits from previous generations. Whereas this is a really important and very interesting conversation to have. As a psychologist, this is probably not where I'm going to be very comfortable having sharing expertise. I can tell you that, for example, our best understanding of genetics involvement in phenotypes, especially kind of those type of soft phenotypes like personality disorders or personality characteristics, etc., are ones that are quite unexciting. And by unexciting, I mean that similar to diseases, for example, genes are involved in most health-related elements, and they determine very, very few. So yes, there are elements that are going to be completely, if there's nothing that actually shortens one's life trajectory, so a disease doesn't manifest itself, then the genes will make sure it does. So Huntington disease, for example, we may carry a gene that would lead us to develop Huntington disease if we reach a specific age. And it's not that the gene is only kind of yes-no trigger. It actually can also indicate quite precisely when symptoms will be introduced by just how many repetition of specific nucleotide will appear on those relevant genes. So yes, there are obviously diseases, disorders that are that connected to genetics, but most are not. And what a lot of the field of genetics, behavioral genetics, etc., has been attempting to do for many decades is try to quantify how much is something genetic, how much is it environmental, and they have quite sophisticated and quite also simple tools to evaluate it. Personally, I find that those tools are wanting. I think they produce values that look very accurate. You can have like decimal points suggesting that you can really kind of parcel the responsibility to genes versus environment to that degree of accuracy. But most of it, as far as I'm concerned, is smoke and mirrors. The problem is that genes and environment are so interconnected that trying to parcel one from the other is put out to some degree, but also harmful, as we're probably going to talk later on. And that's probably where my expertise is lying. How is it harmful? How is it potentially beneficial?
It's so beautiful to hear you speak in that way and be so methodical and considered about your words in this space. And that's what I hope we would always see from academia, where understanding, genes are involved in many diseases and the like. And we know that, through methylation of particular genes, things can show up or not, but they determine, very few that we don't have strong scientific evidence that specifically says yes, with the significance nature that we need to be able to report on. Having said that, the media, on the other hand, doesn't act accordingly. And so we hear things like, the depression gene or the obesity gene and all sorts of stuff, which
or the divorce genes or the success gene, or very interesting kind of suggestive that use the same tools that we use to look at, for example, disease or characteristics, phenotypes. And we can find that there is a gene for success in the same way that there is a gene for obesity, in the same way that there is a gene for divorce, in the same way that there is a gene for cancer. All of them using those tools would manifest itself. But I think that while people find a disease gene or a cancer gene something a bit that is not really conflicting with their understanding of the world, they would find it harder to see a gene for success. And again, all that is revolving around what we understand genes to do, what we understand genes to represent, rather than what genes exactly do, which is code for production of proteins.
And what are some of the pitfalls that you see that come from exploring this world? I mean, I always have a concern that the written word, or the word on a podcast or the word on television, this stuff just so often for so many just gets absorbed without any thought whatsoever. It's like people read a headline. They don't read the article. They don't actually read beyond the article. They don't even complete the article, and they actually don't even critique the article. They just read that first line, which says something like a divorce gene or obesity gene or success gene or depression gene, and they formulate an opinion on that. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and obviously, incorporating your other passions of existential psychology, how we make decisions, and the impact of that. Because to me, it's one of the big concerns that I have in psychology is human beings, particularly hearing things around genes and then removing their own responsibility because it's outside of their power. Because that's what genes sound like to the layperson.
Indeed. If you'll allow me, I think that a lot of the time, just telling a story that completely conveys the problem in something that's very relatable can be helpful. So when I started presenting my research about genetic essentialism, which is a term that is going to be probably featured quite a lot later in our conversation, I was trying to give something accessible to the audience, something that moves it away from scary terminology and very kind of removed understanding or perception of understanding of a deeply developed science. So let me introduce you to a friend of mine. My friend name is Joe. He's been working for Immigration Canada. I was living in Canada for a few years, and he's been working there for over 15 years. And Joe is quite of a heavyset person. And he's not very happy about it. He's been trying out many different diets throughout his life. He also makes himself go out to the gym kind of twice or 3 times a week, really trying to control his expanding waistline. One day he calls me and he says, "Oh, you can't believe what I've just read. I opened the New York Times. I don't know even why. I never do it before. And I came across this article saying that scientists discover the fat gene, or what we other people call the obesity gene." And I was actually feeling quite relieved to see that. So why are you feeling relieved? He said, "Well, at least now I understand that it's not what I do. It's not because of me. It's because I was born this way. And therefore, all my negative self-talk, all the diets that I've tried, they didn't work out. Now I understand why. I can also now stop going to this darn gym because I really am not enjoying it. And I feel much better about my ability to say, here's your membership. I do not want to see you again." So that's Joe. That's Joe reading the exact headlines that you were talking about before. And that Joe relates those headlines to decades of experiences that they've had throughout their life, and see it not only as some kind of a very cold understanding of science, but instead of something very personal to them, something that has meaning in how they're going to live their life now on. So Joe, let me basically bring him out of the closet. Joe is a virtual person. Joe doesn't really exist. But what I found through my own research is that there's a little Joe in most of us. So I'll give you an example of how I took Joe and made an experiment out of him. I brought individuals to basically a lab, and just like you've mentioned, people read, consume media, and much of the scientific media that is made accessible to the lay intelligent person is about genes. We see it's ubiquitous. If you ever follow science sections of main media outlets, invariably you're going to see something about genetics at least once a week, most likely a few times a week. So the consumer of such media will have kind of substantial exposure to arguments about genes. Now, I would love to vilify media. Who doesn't? But I don't think that the media is, particularly more vilifiable here. Because I think the media is actually basically channeling the same biases that we have as individuals. And it just reflects it back to us. Journalists are human beings, surprisingly enough. And as such, they are susceptible to many of the cognitive biases that human beings are susceptible. One of them is exactly what I'm talking about, which is genetic essentialism. And a bit later, maybe we're going to break it down to what are specific cognitive biases that emerge from that phenomenon. So I invited people, and I have basically provide them with something I termed a measure of verbal intelligence. And because people are familiar with those kind of measures, there was also an article in it, followed by multiple choice questions, where it's supposed to be reading comprehension. And my manipulation was basically disguised as those articles. So in one condition, participants read about scientists discover an obesity gene kind of headline. Again, very common in the literature. And in another, we provided them with very similar account of obesity that revolves instead on social network. Again, another thing that actually has scientific support as a kind of etiological element in obesity. So when the people around us are gaining weight, we are more likely to gain weight. When people around us are losing weight, we are more likely to lose weight. And in a third condition, we just talk about food production to kind of, stay within food, but unrelated to etiological explanation for obesity. And after participants completed a few tasks, one of them being that reading comprehension, we thanked them and we told them, hey, the experiment is over, you can leave now. However, as you can see, we are a lab that does a lot of research about psychology of food, and we are trying to find a very good baked good to use in future research that will be revolving around actual consumption of food. Would you be willing to help us with giving us your opinion about how good is the actual baked good? And all of them, invariably, students at the university were happy to get some cookies, said yes. So we took them to a different room on a different floor where we actually baked cookies, and it was smelling heavenly. I think for months at a time, I had all the people around the offices come to me and say, do you have any more cookies to give us? And it was it was a very, very good time to be a researcher back then. And I certainly got a lot of points among my colleagues for that. But what we wanted to do is basically see if following that reading comprehension, that exposure to explanation for obesity or a control condition, we will see a difference in how much would the participants consume when they are basically given a bowl of broken cookies and they are allowed to have as many as they want by themselves in a room. And what we found was actually, I think, even the effect was expected. The magnitude of the effect surprised me personally. So we found that participants who read about that obesity gene consumed 50% more in weight of those cookies than participants in the control condition.
That's significant.
It was significant, but it was also substantial. So yes, it was something that I think really for me drove home that, fictional Joe that I was mentioning. And that's why I really identified Joe in, probably every one of us. I think we read or we hear about a gene that is associated or potentially determined, usually scientifically inaccurately, but that's how we often hear it, a phenotype, and then we just throw our hands in the air and say, well, no point in fighting it.
Yeah, and that's the point, I think, not using the word significant from a scientific perspective, as in a significant result, but a substantial result, as in 50% quantity based. Measured by weight is a lot. That's kind of like saying I had a glass of water, or I had a glass and a half of water. That it's a big difference, and obviously it potentially alludes to the removal of self-efficacy, of saying what is the point of behavior change, restriction, acting in accordance with the knowledge base that I have, of limiting my consumption if it doesn't matter, because the obesity gene is set and planted, and I don't have much to contribute in this space.
Indeed, and while I think this example is something that many people may actually relate to personally, it's hardly the only area in our lives where we can see the same biases basically working out and affecting our, in this case, behavior. Sometimes it's attitude, sometimes it would be emotional responses. It can be a variety of actual outcomes that can come from our exposure to some sort of genetic etiological claims out there, especially when they come with some sort of a scientific, respectable umbrella as the source. And again, it combines our tendency to have some sort of a respect to science as a conveyor of explanation, which is something that I'm very happy as a scientist that we have, but it also brings about our limited understanding of what it is. And let's say if we talk about string theory, string theory is a fascinating theory. Not many of us are using claims from string theory in our daily lives. We don't use a lot of metaphors from string theory in our daily life. We're not guiding our behavior or the way that we are navigating the world in light of our understanding of string theory. Arguably, most of us are not much more familiar with what genes really do than we are with what string theory really tells us. Nevertheless, we are using it in a metaphorical way constantly. Kobe Bryant, great basketball player, maybe one of the best ever to walk this earth, hardly a genetic scientist, I think, used to use that, the DNA of the Lakers team, the team he used to play for in the NBA. A team doesn't have a DNA. He didn't mean it in a geneticist kind of way of meaning it. What Kobe Bryant was talking about is the essence of that Lakers team, that in its core, the essence of that team is such. And instead of saying that, he just used something that everyone understands, which is the DNA of the Lakers team. No one raised an eyebrow. What does it mean? The Lakers team doesn't even have a body. How does it have a gene? No one was asking that. It's clear to everyone. And it's clear to everyone because we borrowed a very, very complex scientific entity, and we're using it in a way that makes sense to everyone around us, but not necessarily in a way that science would suggest it's appropriate to use it.
It's interesting while you're talking about that, the first person that popped up in my mind was Deepak Chopra, who has used quite significantly the word quantum, and he's very articulate, and clearly he is very intelligent. But within that, he's also been able to use words like quantum, healing, quantum synchronicity, quantum, and because he can speak at length and quite compellingly on these topics, it comes across with great confidence, and it's quite easy to then digest and say, wow, it comes from a credible source. And we put the word quantum, which means, oh, well, quantum equals science. We know things at that level. And so, now if I think in a particular way, that can coexist somewhere else, and therefore I can attract X and Y, and my goodness, at least some concerning decisions can be made for people who might not be so critical of that work, or have that literacy. If we talk about that, was there? Sorry to jump back a little bit, Ilan. Was there any moderating factor around someone's capacity to I'm not sure what the language is, but their capacity to critique, literacy, the criticism of, I'm sure there's a term here, but how to have a critical mind when reading these things, and how that potentially moderates the quantity of cookies that someone might eat. And it might not be that particular research that you would have looked at, but in the literature, does that moderate things?
I'm sure there are quite a few moderates, because there is enough variability in the responses of people to suggest that we are not uniformly reacting to those kind of, in my case, manipulation. When it appears in, I don't know, the LA Time, more of a natural field study. But we do have research to suggest that there is certain elements that can moderate specific manifestation of genetic essentialism, but we haven't really seen something that seems to consistently moderate across different domains.
Yeah.
Our best indication for something that would be closely resembling a moderate across different domains would be education. So just general level of education can moderate or reduce, in this case, that essentialist responses, that throwing our arms in the air and saying we can't do anything about it because it's in our genes. And surprisingly enough, I would have expected that specifically biological education, genetic education, would be even better predicted than education in general. So far, we don't have a clear indication that that's the case. In my own research, when I looked at different manifestations, I found that I cannot identify biological education and genetic education as more potent than general education in producing some kind of inoculation, although very limited in its efficacy.
It's so interesting. After about 5 seconds of you talking with your response, I thought to myself, that's a dumb question. Of course, there's going to be that variability, but it just shows even your own bias of how we talk, as though inoculation is a thing that can be provided, versus, of course, there's variation. Evolution says there has to be. The answer will always be yes, but the devil's in the detail. So it's funny to just observe myself in that as well.
And look, I have to admit that, funnily enough, so I've been studying genetic essentialism for the better part of over 2 decades now. I've been working with, collaborated pretty much all this time on various projects with my mentor from my PhD training, Professor Stephen Heine from University of British Columbia, who actually wrote also a great book about it, not directed to the scientific community, but what we call trade book, something to the general public. And Steve sent his own saliva sample to one of those direct-to-consumer testing company. And you get a full report back about various genetic elements with not only kind of physiological elements, but also things like, in his case, it was something that really shook him up, intelligence, for example. So the specific allele that is probably the one that has the most association that we have currently with just intelligence test scores. And he found he doesn't have that allele. So person who's been doing research on genetic essentialism as long as I have been doing research on genetic essentialism, who is intimately familiar with all the biases of our understanding of what genes are, says, I was staring at that report and I felt, oh, that's a shame. I could have been more intelligent. I'm like, oh, I felt I'm just not as intelligent as I thought I was before I saw that report. And beyond the actual association, which is tiny, because probably most of our genes are intelligence genes. There is no single gene that makes us intelligent or not. And even polygenetic scores can predict only that much of the variability in intelligence. But nevertheless, even a person who is so intimately familiar with our biased perspective on genes can be susceptible to use exactly that essentialistic approach that we are consistently warning people of. So I think point being is that even knowing of that tendency, that essentialistic tendency, and perhaps in a minute I should try to explain why we call it essentialistic tendency and what it all means. But even a person who is so intimately familiar with it can be susceptible from an emotive, at least, perspective, from how does that person feel once he learns about something genetics about themselves, is showing how it's hard to shed, just because we know something, it's hard to shed our understanding that might be pre-existing and much less nuanced as we would expect.
It's so fascinating how drawn humans are to have a narrative, to give a reason, to explain. And, you know, that's where these biases come from. They're confirming biases that says if I have a body of knowledge, you know, I tend to attract more of the same. I can easily cut away anything that is different to or goes against, and continue to just reinforce my framework. But you know, language is powerful. Statements are powerful. We've all felt them, and I think something that you said earlier about, you know, the explanation of Joe. There's a bit of Joe in all of us. You know, it's such an elegant way to talk about this.
Unfortunately, I don't think I shed my own inner Joe again after 20 years of intimately researching and understanding the phenomenon that basically, you know, created that small little Joe inside us all. but if I can again
Go back to
zoom out a
the
bit,
essentialistic tendencies you were wanting to elaborate on.
and that's exactly what I'm trying to zoom up a bit, because we are considering genes and genetics as a science. It's been barely over a century since we truly understood the level of, or the actual element that is responsible for our inheritance. So when Darwin wrote about the evolutionary theory, he wrote at a time when they did not know what is in our body responsible for transmitting that inheritance of traits, of diseases, etc. So genes have been discovered in the 20th century, 50, 60 years after Darwin has started his own claims about how evolution works. So we didn't need to know what the actual vehicle for the inheritance from one generation to another to already provide a quite nuanced understanding of how that of the outcome of that vehicle. But because genes as a concept are barely over 100 years old, it doesn't mean that genes as a metaphor were not there long before. So the idea of genetic essentialism may be limited to the time that we understood what genes are, but the concept of essentialism, or in its more general form, what's called psychological essentialism, is probably been with us as a species ever since we had enough intelligence to look at the world around us and try to make sense out of it. So psychological essentialism is basically the tendency to try to create categories, to be able to navigate a world of so many instances and individuals, even with the sheer computing powers that we have between our ears, we would just find it intractable. If we cannot simplify the world around us to specific rules and category-based rules, we would not be able to actually wrap our heads and navigate that environment. So we need simplifications. So categories are vital to our ability to navigate the world successfully. And to create categories, we need tools. We need some kind of cognitive enabling elements that would allow us to create categories in a way that is both efficient and inferential. Allows us to make good inferences about the world, so we don't, end up putting our head under the sword, because it makes sense to do that, because swords is one of the things that we also use metal for, just like beds, and we put our heads on a bed. So if we are failing in creating useful categories, then we are very likely going to have a hard time surviving to an age of reproduction, which suggests that those individuals are no longer with us. Psychological essentialism is one of the most powerful ways to make sense and to make categories, because it assumes that natural entities, things like organisms, things like minerals, have an underlying nature or essence that make them what they are. So a lion is a member of that family of lions, and by being a member of that category, it shares an essence and nature with all other lions. And that nature gives rise to the characteristics we see. So it kind of it reverses the logic. Instead of saying, if you have characteristic A, B, and C, and D, then you are a lion, it flips it. it says if you are a lion, you will have the characteristics A, B, and C. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because it flips the causal element to something that metaphysically has been shown not to be there. So if you think about what's the essence of a human being, if there is an essence, then let's say you are a person who is materialistic, like many scientists are. It needs to be a material, it needs to be something. Where is that essence? Where does it sit? Which body organ you have that is the essence? So metaphysically, again, that essence doesn't exist. There's a great, philosophical and also psychological accounts that do a great job dismissing it as a metaphysical phenomenon. But I think that most of your listeners can probably, reach that conclusion themselves by just kind of reflecting on it. That essence that doesn't exist is still something that we hold very strongly to. So if we take adults and even children, they show that tendency to see that underlying essence in natural categories. So if you take, and that experiments have been done with children, has been done with adults, if you take an animal, let's say an animal like a sheep, and you are changing a lot of that sheep, so you surgically make it look like a goat, and you change the vocal cords so it would make noises like a goat, and you change any physical feature that makes it look like a sheep to make it look like a goat. Do you have a goat or do you have a sheep? Ask children, and almost invariably they're all going to say, no, it's still a sheep. Doesn't matter that you did all that, you didn't change the essence of that animal. And even if you add psychological treatment that makes it think like a goat, it doesn't really matter. There's nothing you can do to a sheep to make it a goat. Why is that? If the features are what determines the category, then at one point you would have a goat. But because there is an essence or perceived essence, then there is nothing that you can actually do to get rid of that essence. And that's led a lot of individuals, when they're talking about psychological essentialism, to indicate that that essence is non-materialistic, almost by definition. So that essence, the characteristic of that essence is it is unseen, it's deterministic, it's causal, it's inherited, and it is basically the thing that is causing all the phenotypes, all the actual characteristics that we can see. And that's great. But if you look at all those elements that we are using to define an essence, they are one-to-one the way that we are seeing what genes are. Genes are unseen. They are perceived as cause of phenotype. They are inherited. They are stable throughout life, just like the essence. So all those defining elements of our metaphysical misunderstanding of essence are shared with our misunderstanding of genes, leading us to kind of use genes, just like Kobe Bryant did, to prescribe what otherwise would be just called essence. And the fact that psychological essentialism has been around and can be seen in writings that are 3,000-4,000 years old, and can be seen in children that were born in Norway or in the Kalahari, suggests that we can have something that is very human in nature. And the fact that Steve Heine, with all his understanding of genetic essentialism, is still susceptible just shows how deep that that metaphysical misunderstanding is within us.
And maybe, I mean, first of all, what you've said there is absolutely mind-boggling to see how we can so easily flip the equation and then completely misunderstand. I'm going to use a big word here, but it feels like misunderstand everything. That we can be so misguided just by not pausing because of the nature of needing to communicate rapidly and quickly and just live a regular life. We don't pause to try and understand how these relate to one another, and we so easily do, the causal relationship, but we end up doing it in both ways, and then we tend to just lean into the one that's easier. It almost starts a conversation around potentially why we might be observing categories being pulled into almost tribalistic ways when we talk about, an us and them, and what essence we have as us and what essence they have, and the threat response therefore of difference shows up, and it creates tension, creates conflict, and whether it's imaginary borders or imaginary categories, imaginary ideas, we then get into a tug of war with others, other categories, in particular.
I think that kind of leads us to the extension of psychological essentialism, and by extension, genetic essentialism. So, as I've mentioned, the perception of essence is guided towards natural entities, so organisms, minerals, etc. Human artifacts do not fall into that category. So if I take a chair and I remove its back and I extend its leg and I put it on the floor and put a vase on it, and I'm showing a kid or an adult that much and says, well, this chair, I did all that to that chair. Is that a chair now? And they're going to see the images, or they're going to see the process, and they say, no, it's a table now. So they have no problem now
they're happy to say, yes, it's a goat.
because the category is functional, exactly. But we cannot do it with a sheep and a goat. Now, where your very wise words come into effect is when we're looking at social categories. So social categories are human artifacts. So why do we care about differences in skin color but not in eye color? It's because of some sort of consensus, some sort of a social decision made somewhere. One can argue that one is more prominent or more clear, etc. But other can argue that, with actual skin tone, skin color, or the way that we use it, is a very ineffective way, because skin tone is continuous, whereas our categorization for race are not. So social categories are much better described as human artifacts. We gave them meaning. We gave kind of the borders and the divides between them. However, social categories are one human artifacts that fall very much into that essentialism or psychological essentialism camp. So we seem to essentialize those human categories, those racial categories, gender categories, sexual orientation categories, in the same way that we essentialize organisms. So there is an essence to being a woman versus being a man. Men are from Venus, women from Mars, or vice versa. There is an essence to being Aboriginal in Australia versus a white conqueror or colonialist in Australia. There is an essence of being African versus East Asian. There's an essence of being African American versus European American. All those categories seems to have some kind of a perception of an underlying metaphysical essence. And that metaphysical essence also creates some kind of inferences and predictions. So research in America shows that there's perception of dangerousness of Black Americans much more than of white Americans. And that seems to be something that is there even for people who are either explicitly or truly do not feel that they are racist, but they still get that apprehensiveness. There's an underlying kind of perception that then guides the very successful promotion of the Born This Way narrative in the LGBT community. So we can see that the greater use of that we are born that way, we are genetically same-sex attracted as a narrative was probably one of the most potent and effective campaigns in shifting public perception about acceptability of same-sex relationship. So we also see it experimentally when you lead people to be exposed to that gene for homosexuality, for example. Most research would suggest that you can then see more positive attitudes towards LGBT individuals, more support for policies that are designed to make the world more equal as far as LGBT are concerned, etc., etc. And when I say most, it's very important that it's most, because that leads us to another element of genetic essentialism, which is called the double-edged sword of genetic essentialism. So on the one hand, here's an example where that genetic essentialist perspective can be something that would lead to decreased prejudice and stigma out there. For most of us, that would be a very positive outcome. However, that is because some of the biases that come from genetic essentialism are ones that can reduce what we would call blameworthiness. So the deterministic element, so genetic essentialism suggests that an outcome is more likely to be deterministic if it comes from genes compared to come from another explanation, just like the example with the obesity social network explanation that was explicitly, associated to the same degree in our primes as the genetic one. But the genetic led to the increased eating, whereas the just as potent alternative environmental explanation did not. So it's not a potency, it's not the strength of the association, it's the fact that it's genes versus something else. So determinism is increased by just calling something genetic versus by a different name. It's also related to what we called the naturalness bias. So genes are perceived to be natural. So if something is genetic, something is also natural, because it's not a product of human manipulation. And we all know that anything natural sounds to us much better. So although cyanide is natural, it kills you, but that's great. We still see in the supermarkets shelf after shelf of products that claim all natural ingredients. Well, cyanide is a natural ingredient. You don't want it in your food, but they are still using that because we associate positivity with nature and with natural elements. And that's what's called naturalistic fallacy. If something is natural, something is morally acceptable, something is good, etc. So you have two biases that come from genetic essentialism that would arguably reduce things like stigma in that case. However, there is another bias, which we called the bias that is homogeneity or discreteness. So when we are thinking about genes as creating categories, because those categories are now imbued with all the things that we believe genes to be, which is stable, which is non-overlapping. So they create categories that have much more rigid boundaries. If it's genetic, you cannot be both. If it's genetic, the whole idea of continuum goes up the window because you have to be in one category or the other. You have the gene and therefore you're X. You don't have the gene and therefore you're Y. Y and X do not overlap. So that creates some sort of a view that in-group members of the same race, members of the same gender, doesn't matter, are more similar to each other when you are thinking about the categories as influenced by genes. And the unfortunate part, out-group members are further away from your in-group. So if you think from genes perspective, from genetic perspective, and you have that genetic essentialist biases, you are seeing people that are not in your shared genes group as much more different than when you saw them as, out-group members, but you didn't think in a genetic way. And that means that all the social sciences research that suggests that the more the otherness element increases prejudice, well, genetic perspectives create stronger otherness, creates stronger boundaries, create greater distance between different categories. And that's why some of the research about sexual orientation, for example, finds the opposite, that emphasizing the gene for homosexuality leads some people, and we talked about variability before, leads some people to actually double down, to actually experience greater dislike of LGBT, greater opposition to support for equal measures such as marriage or adoption of children. So that's all these biases seem to be cascading out of what's called genetic essentialism, but while some are potentially reducing prejudice, others increase it.
There's also a forcing function that research leans into, looking at genetics because it appears to be so deterministic, and obviously media like that because naturally provides them with greater viewership and engagement. It almost organically starts to move more in one direction because of these forcing functions, and continues to then reinforce that genetics equals causation, deterministic, and therefore gets used all the way to the DNA of the team, or in a different way where we start doing the us and them, and we lose these types of conversations where there's much more nuance, there's much more sophistication in giving an opportunity to explore these ideas and look at how those relationships occur, and also not to be critical, not to do the same thing, which is, to point fingers and go us and them, but look at what are the functions that are making the world lean into a certain direction or not, because all of these things, I think, when considered in a mindful way, you can at least begin to think about why are they leaning in that direction, not from a causative way and saying that all assumptions will be right, but in trying to do an explanatory way without judgment, without another additional category of right, wrong, us, them. So like, even your reference previously about the media, not to go out and, crucify them. It's something I certainly have done in the past and have leaned into, and certainly from this conversation, I will be thinking about that differently, because it's not a part of the solution or a part of how I want to be viewing the world.
And again, like looking at the literature and looking actually at least leading newspapers and the way that they address genetic and genetics research in their publication, I do find that it seems that they have moved from the oversimplification, the obesity genes, the divorce genes, to a more nuanced associative kind of claims. Unfortunately, what my research suggests is there's less sensitivity to the way that you are presenting genetics. It's more about, if you say genetics, that's it. So even if the media is trying to portray a more accurate picture, our own biases as consumers, as readers of that media, are ones that basically, once that keyword is there, we lose that sensitivity to nuance. Oh, it said only associated. No, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Genes are there. We cannot do, let's throw our hands in the air.
Very much in line with relational frame theory, that once a category is in place, you get those, not necessarily two teams, but it's easier to explain in two teams. There might be, there's many teams, but we know what's on each side, good and bad, nature, that's on the good side. If we go out and say, a football team, that one has a bit of nuance to it, but someone might say football, that's on the bad side, or we have clear categories about where things should be. Global warming, we all know what that is. That one definitely has to be bad. Even though we don't have, I have zero comprehension about that incredibly complex and poorly understood by the masses conversation. I think it's probably a hard one for scientists, let alone for lay people like myself. But we know where it belongs. I know that global warming is bad, and I know that solar panels are good. And that's all I kind of need to know. And to hell with the rest, But those relational frames, once they get a hold, they're hard to break. And genetics, equals deterministic, at least at the moment, without giving it some more thought.
It is. And then again, this is something that we are still searching for a way that we can communicate nuance in a way that doesn't trigger deterministic perspectives, fatalistic perspective. It's an uphill battle. We still haven't we've offered throughout, I've offered throughout my, publication history, some suggestions. There's some limited support for a few suggestions, but it's not consistent and it's not very powerful. So it's still something that would be a great contribution if one would find a really effective way to diminish genetic essentialism, to diminish psychological essentialism in general. Genetics is just, the latest to captivate it. Heraclitus and other Greek philosophers were probably looking at other ones, humors, in ancient Greece, the four humors and the balance between them as the essence of health and essence of characteristics. The type of people who have more black bile are individuals who are XYZ compared to individuals who have red bile. And so the terminology has changed. The things that we are considered to be the carrier of that metaphysical essence may have shifted. But, as a species, we're completely, remarkably, attached to that view of the world. And again, it's probably there because it is providing us most of the time with a useful function. It provides us with a way to create categories that most of the time are useful from a survival perspective. The cost in modern world is just rising because a lot of the threats that we may have encountered 2,000 years ago are no really much of a threat anymore in our urban environment that is deprived of wolves and bears and, other potential predators.
Mm-hmm. It seems like there isn't that silver bullet because it's so multidimensional, multifactorial as to how we can functionally continue to live in this world while also hold that nuance. I think maybe that's why education might be somewhat of a moderator as a hypothesis, but that means lots of exposure. There might be some individual traits that, as you say, is still not well understood well enough, but whether it might be some openness trait of personality or whether it be agreeableness. But education, the idea about that is exposure. Can we sit in a room, do lots of reading, have robust conversations, tutorials that then look at what the information says, right on both sides of the arguments and etc. One of the things that strikes me about you is how selective you are with language, how incredibly well spoken you are, how well read and how learned you are in what you say. Very stable, and it's so impressive to be able to talk to you today, and just want to thank you for your time. I could listen to you and ask you so many more questions and hopefully build my own wisdom over time. I could do this for days. How can, or where can I and where can the listeners find out more about these topics, your work, any publications, or any that are interested to work alongside you? How can we get in touch?
Well, my work is mostly appearing in journal articles and sometimes in some books in chapters form. So first of all, let me try to kind of convey my appreciation of the completely unjust evaluations of me as a person and my intellectual prowess. I will take it. I will not reject it. but I at best can aspire to be the person who you've described. Nevertheless, it was truly a pleasure to be here and to have that conversation with you. And I think just, as you said, I can continue to too much probably to discuss those things. I find them fascinating. I find you as a great person to have that conversation with. So thank you. My research is available online. So if a person just Googles my own name, they can find that I have a profile on a website called ResearchGate, where a lot of academics are making their research available to the public. So some of my articles appear in journals that are behind what's called paywall. So people who do not have subscription would have to actually pay to have access to that information.
And that's researchgate.net.
ResearchGate, I think, org or...
org, is it?
It is, no, .net, you're right. Yes.
.net. It says here join for free. I'm just looking it up now. It says join for free, so...
Yes. So, again, it's not a website that has any kind of hostile intentions. It doesn't chase you with suggestion to buy toilet paper or a new sofa. So it's a good place for people to come if they're interested in actual research. I find that the type of research I do as a first and foremost social psychologist is quite accessible for people. I'm trying to minimize the use of jargon. You don't need to have a specific training, I believe, to understand what I'm doing. Maybe the statistics part would be something that would be more clear to people who know the statistics, but the statistics part is something that you can just believe that what I found statistically is what I found, because there are peer reviewers that made that kind of quality assurance. So the narrative itself, I think, is accessible to most individuals who speak English. And yes, I've made my research available there. And also, if anyone wants to use that website to get in touch with me, there's an option of doing it. There's also an option of just doing it by emailing me. If, again, you Google me, you can find a lot of ways to get in touch with me quite easily. So I'm not going to challenge people to get a paper and pen and write down a long email. So it's just much easier.
And just check out the University of Sydney for those listeners. So
again, Nesh, it was truly a joy to have this conversation with you. You are extremely hospitable and extremely intelligent, asking great questions. So you made my last hour and a half truly enjoyable.
Thank you, and thank you for your generosity and intelligence, and for sharing as well, for knowledge exchange for myself first and foremost, and also for our listeners. I'd love to have you back at some point to either continue this conversation or to look at other areas. I know that you've got many other passions and areas to be able to speak on. So thank you. Appreciate you and appreciate your time.
Thank you, Nesh.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.